The range officer called the range cold at 0600, and no one was paying attention to the woman at lane 12. She had arrived before anyone else. That was the first thing people noticed later, when they were trying to piece together how they had missed what was right in front of them. She had signed in, taken her lane, and set up without drawing a single look from the men filing in around her. That was not unusual. Women at Fort Bragg had been not unusual for long enough that they had become invisible in a different way. Present but not counted, there but not seen. The range officer Petrov had clocked her out of professional habit and then moved on. She was small. She carried her case without effort, which registered somewhere below thought. He went back to his clipboard. Her name was Lassiter. She was 29 years old. She had been assigned to the 3rd Support Battalion 3 months earlier, in a logistics capacity, which was the kind of detail that made people stop listening before you finished the sentence. Logistics. Support. The words had a way of disappearing from a conversation the moment they were spoken. She wore the uniform correctly. She kept her eyes forward. She said "sir" when she meant it, and nothing when she didn't. Nobody at Fort Bragg had any particular reason to pay attention to Lassiter. That was precisely how she wanted it. The qualification round began at 0615. 23 soldiers on the line, targets at 200, 300, and 500 meters. The morning was flat and gray, the kind of October cold that doesn't ache yet but promises it will. Downrange, the silhouettes waited. Lassiter put 12 rounds through the 500-meter target in under 40 seconds. She did not hurry. She did not adjust her position between shots. Her breathing was something that happened below the level of calculation, an old rhythm that her body had long since committed to memory. When the line went cold again and the scores came in, Petrov looked at the tally twice before he looked up. He looked at lane 12. She was already breaking down her rifle. There is a particular kind of silence that falls over a group of men when something happens that doesn't fit the story they were already telling. It's not loud. It doesn't announce itself. It's the pause between one thought and the next. The moment when the mind catches on something and can't immediately move past it. That silence fell over the qualification range at Fort Bragg on the morning of October 14th, and most of the men standing there wouldn't have been able to name what caused it. Ruiz leaned toward Garrett and said something low that didn't carry. Garrett was still looking downrange. Petrov wrote the number on the sheet and kept his face very still. Lassiter closed her case, picked up her brass, and walked back toward the equipment shed without looking at anyone. She had scored higher than every other shooter on the line. She had outscored the battalion's designated marksman by 11 points. The designated marksman was a staff sergeant named Holt, 8 years in, 2 tours to Afghanistan, a man who wore his qualification badges the way other men wear their identity. He stood at lane 9 with his score sheet in his hand and said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "Run it again." Petrov said the scores were final. Holt said, "I want to see her form." What he meant, and what everyone present understood him to mean, was that something had gone wrong in the counting. What he meant was that the number was impossible, and someone had made an error. What he was not prepared to say out loud, because saying it out loud would require acknowledging that the thought was happening, was that a woman in a support role had just shot better than he had on his best day, at his best range in 8 years of doing this for a living. Petrov said the scores stood. Lassiter, from the equipment shed doorway, said nothing. She had her case in her hand, and her eyes were focused somewhere between Petrov and the middle distance, a gaze that had learned a long time ago not to flinch at things said in certain tones of voice. She waited. The moment passed. She left. She drove back to the support battalion office, and she filed a maintenance requisition, and she ate lunch alone at a table near the window. And none of that was remarkable either. That was Tuesday. What nobody at Fort Bragg knew about Lassiter was that she had spent 4 years before her current assignment in a role that did not appear anywhere in the documentation visible to her current chain of command. The transfer paperwork listed her MOS as 92A, Automated Logistical Specialist. It did not list the 18 months she had spent embedded with a joint task force in eastern Syria. It did not list the 3 confirmed engagements in which her position had come under direct fire. It did not list what had happened in the Deir ez-Zor corridor on the night of March 9th, 2 years earlier, when a convoy of 8 vehicles had been reduced to 2, and someone had to hold a defensive perimeter for 6 hours until extraction could reach them. There were people who knew what had happened in that corridor. None of them were at Fort Bragg. Lassiter had requested the reassignment herself. She had been very specific about what she wanted. She had wanted something quiet. She had wanted the kind of work that required paperwork and inventory counts and scheduled maintenance cycles. She had wanted, for reasons she did not explain to the officer who approved her transfer and who seemed mildly puzzled by the request, to be somewhere that nobody was shooting at her for a while. She had a daughter. Her daughter was 7 years old. Her daughter lived with Lassiter's sister in Fayetteville, 4 miles from Post, and on the days Lassiter wasn't working, she drove those 4 miles and she sat at a kitchen table and she watched her daughter do homework and she did not think about Syria. That was what she had asked for. That was what she had been given. It lasted until November. The incident that broke it open was not dramatic in the way that incidents in stories are often dramatic. There was no single moment of confrontation, no room where everyone gathered, and the truth came out like a curtain being pulled. It happened the way most things happen, which is slowly and then all at once, and it started with a man named Vickers. Vickers was a captain. He was 34 years old and had the kind of confidence that comes from never having been seriously wrong about anything important. He ran the 3rd Support Battalion with a precise efficiency that he had mistaken, over time, for a complete understanding of how things worked. He was not a bad officer. He was simply a man who had learned that the world operated within certain parameters, and he had stopped checking whether those parameters were still accurate. He had, in particular, a set of beliefs about what the support personnel under his command were capable of. Lassiter had been under his command for 3 months without making him revise those beliefs. She was quiet. She did her work. She didn't ask for anything. This was, in Vickers's assessment, exactly what a soldier in her position should be doing, which meant he had essentially stopped thinking about her as a variable. That was his first mistake. The second one came on a Tuesday in November, during a training exercise that had been designed to simulate a supply convoy interdiction scenario. 2 vehicles, 6 personnel, a route through a wooded range area that was supposed to test decision-making under simulated threat conditions. The exercise was led by Garrett, who was a staff sergeant and who had been running training scenarios for 3 years. The opposing force was 4 soldiers from a separate unit playing the role of threat actors. Blanks and smoke, standard setup. Nobody was expecting anything unusual. The scenario went wrong 12 minutes in. It went wrong in the way that training scenarios sometimes go wrong, which is that one of the variables behaved in a way that fell outside the anticipated range. The vehicle in the lead position took a turn that wasn't on the route and then stopped moving, which was not what was supposed to happen. And by the time Garrett had identified the situation and begun to respond, the notional tactical picture had shifted in a way that the standard training protocol didn't account for. Garrett made 3 decisions in quick succession. All 3 were reasonable. None of them solved the problem. The 4th decision came from the back of the second vehicle, where Lassiter had been sitting with a supply manifest on a clipboard, doing what everyone present had assumed she was there to do, which was observe and document. She didn't ask for permission. She would explain later that there wasn't time, and also that she had, at some level she couldn't quite articulate, made a calculation about what Garrett needed in that moment versus what he was going to say if she asked first. She assessed the terrain from the vehicle window in about 3 seconds, identified the most defensible anchor point, and said, in a voice that was not loud but was absolutely certain, "Garrett, pull left, 12 meters. Put the vehicle nose toward the tree line at 11 o'clock. I need Ruiz and Calloway on the right flank now." Garrett turned around. He had known Lassiter for 3 months. In 3 months, she had never spoken in a training environment in any capacity except to answer direct questions. He looked at her face. He didn't know in that moment why he did what she said. He would think about it afterward, and the best explanation he could come up with was that her voice sounded like a person who had already seen how this ended and was trying to prevent it. He pulled left. He put the vehicle nose toward the tree line. Ruiz and Calloway moved to the right flank. The opposing force, who had been expecting the standard response pattern that every convoy training scenario produced, encountered a defensive position they hadn't planned for, and the scenario played out in a way that the after-action review would later describe as a decisive tactical advantage to the Blue Force. That was how it was written in the report. What the report did not capture was the 12 seconds after the scenario ended, when the smoke was still clearing, and Garrett was standing next to the vehicle looking at Lassiter, who was already writing something on her clipboard. And he said, "Where did that come from?" And she said, "Geometry." And he said, "That's not what I meant." And she kept writing. Vickers read the after-action report at his desk on a Wednesday afternoon, and he read the part about the decisive tactical advantage, and he read the name next to the notation, and he read it again. Then he pulled Lassiter's file, and he read that too, which was a thing he had not done since she arrived, because her file, as he understood it, did not contain anything that would require careful reading. He was wrong about that. He called her into his office on Thursday morning. She came in, stood at attention in front of his desk, and waited. He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the file, and then he looked at her, and he said, "Tell me about your previous assignment." She said, "Which part, sir?" He said, "The part that isn't in this file." There was a pause. It lasted exactly long enough for him to understand that she had been waiting for this conversation and had simply been waiting to see if it was ever going to happen. She told him, not everything, because some of it was not hers to tell, but enough. She told him about the task force. She told him about 18 months of operational environments that the word logistics did not meaningfully describe. She told him about Deir ez-Zor in the way that people who were there tell stories about places like that, which is directly and without emphasis, because the emphasis is already built into the facts, and adding more of it would be redundant. Vickers listened. He was, to his credit, the kind of man who could recognize when he had been wrong, without immediately converting that recognition into something that was about him. He listened to the whole thing without interrupting, and when she was done, he sat with it for a moment, and then he said, "Why did you ask for a logistics posting?" She said, "I have a daughter." He didn't say anything after that for a while. The qualification scores had already made their way around the battalion in the way that interesting numbers make their way around small communities. Petrov had not broadcast them, but he hadn't hidden them either. And numbers like that have a way of traveling without assistance. Holt had not said anything further about running the course again. He had gone quiet in a way that people who knew him read as adjustment rather than defeat, which was, as it happened, accurate. He was not a man who needed the world to work a certain way. He was a man who had believed it did and was now revising. That was the difference between Holt and some of the others. The others took longer. There was a conversation at the battalion gym in early December that Lassiter was not present for, which was how she knew about it, because when she was present, those conversations stopped. Garrett was there. Ruiz was there. A few others. The conversation was about whether the qualification scores could have been a statistical anomaly, and then it was about the training scenario, and then it was about what exactly Lassiter's background was, because the version that was circulating was incomplete, and people had started filling in the gaps with guesses. The guesses, Garrett would tell her later, had varied considerably in their accuracy. She didn't tell him which guesses were close. What she did in December was continue to do her job. She processed maintenance requests. She managed inventory cycles. She drove to Fayetteville when she wasn't working, and she sat at the kitchen table, and she watched her daughter do homework. She was not interested in being a story that people told about her. She had been at various points in her life, several different kinds of story that people told, and none of them had felt much like her. The thing that happened in January was not something anyone planned. The battalion was running a live fire exercise at the range complex, a multi-unit event with observers from 2 other battalions, and a general officer who was doing a facilities review and had been scheduled to observe a segment of the training. It was the kind of event that required everything to go correctly, which it did, mostly, until it didn't. The shooter at Lane 7 was a corporal named Deng, who had been having a difficult qualification cycle, and was, on this particular morning, in a state of controlled anxiety that the morning stakes had not improved. He fired 2 shots, both of which went wide in a way that suggested something mechanical rather than technical. He called a ceasefire, which was correct. The range went cold. Petrov went down to look at the weapon and identified a malfunction that required immediate attention, and the standard processor for that was to clear the line, secure the weapon, and pause the exercise. This was not ideal timing given the observation schedule. What made it more complicated was that the general's aide had asked, while the line was cold and the malfunction was being addressed, whether there was any live fire available to observe while the primary line was paused. The question was not directed at anyone in particular. It landed in the general vicinity of several people, including Vickers, who looked briefly toward the secondary range where a scheduled practice session was underway, and then looked at Lassiter, who was standing 8 feet away with a clipboard doing what she was always doing. Lassiter, she looked up. He said, "The secondary range. Can you demonstrate?" What he was asking, and what she understood he was asking, was whether she could put rounds on target in a way that would make the observation period look intentional rather than incidental. It was not a complicated request. It was in fact the kind of request that had a very simple answer, which was yes, she could, and she said so. She walked to the secondary range. She was handed a rifle, which was not hers, and she checked it with the efficiency of someone who has been handed unfamiliar weapons in situations where there was not a great deal of time to get acquainted. She loaded. She took her position. The general and his aide were standing at the observation line. Vickers was behind Lassiter's left shoulder. Several other officers had drifted over in the way that people drift towards something when they sense it might be worth watching, though none of them could have said precisely why they had that sense. Lassiter put 3 rounds through the 500-meter target. She adjusted 17 degrees for a crosswind that Vickers hadn't noticed was present. She put 3 more through a target at 600 meters that was not technically part of the exercise. She did all of this in under 90 seconds. The general had been in the Army for 31 years. He had seen a great deal of marksmanship in those 31 years. He watched Lassiter work, and he did not say anything while she was working, and when she finished and came off the line, he was quiet for a moment before he said, "What's her background?" Vickers told him. The general said, "All of it." Vickers told him all of it, or as much of it as he knew, which was the amount Lassiter had told him in his office in November. The general listened. He looked at Lassiter, who was standing at rest with the rifle still in her hands, and he didn't say anything for a moment, and then he did something that nobody present expected. He walked up to her, and he stopped about 2 feet in front of her, and he looked at her directly. He said, "Dearest Zor, March 9th. She went very still. He said, "I know what happened on that road." He said it quietly, in the way that people speak when they are saying something that they have wanted to say for some time and have not had the occasion to. "I know what you held together that night. I know how many people came home because of what you did." He paused. "I also know it's not in your record." She said, "No, sir." He said it should be. She didn't say anything. He took one step back, and he came to attention in the way that general officers come to attention, which is not casual and is not symbolic, and he saluted her. The range went very quiet. There were 17 people present. Most of them had not been paying particular attention to the secondary range a minute earlier. All of them were paying attention now. Holt was there. Garrett was there. Ruiz was standing 6 feet to the left, with an expression that he would not be able to accurately describe to his wife that evening, because it was the kind of expression that doesn't survive being put into words. Petrov had come over from the primary range during the live fire and was standing at the edge of the group. Lassiter looked at the general for a moment. She returned the salute. He held it 2 beats longer than protocol required. Then he dropped it, turned to Vickers and said, "Make sure the record reflects what it should reflect." He said it the way general officers say things they mean to be done immediately. Vickers said, "Yes, sir." The general looked at Lassiter once more. He said, "Carry on, Sergeant." She said, "Yes, sir." He walked back toward his aide, and the group moved away from the secondary range, and the exercise resumed, and the morning continued being the kind of morning it was, flat and cold and moving toward noon. Lassiter stood at the secondary range for a moment, after everyone had drifted back to their positions. Not because she needed to collect herself, but because she had learned, over several years in places that required this kind of discipline, to give strong feeling somewhere to go, before she moved through a room. The feeling that needed somewhere to go on this particular morning was not triumph. It was not relief. Exactly. It was something smaller and more specific. The quiet sensation of having been seen accurately after a long time of being seen wrong by someone with the authority to know the difference. Holt found her by the equipment shed 20 minutes later. He was carrying 2 cups of coffee, and he held one out without making it into a thing, which she recognized as its own kind of statement. She took it. He said, 8 years I've been the top shot at that range. She said, I know. He said, how long have you been shooting like that? She thought about it. She said, longer than 8 years. He nodded. He drank his coffee. He said, Syria? She said, among other places. He looked at the range, and then he looked at her and he said, I want to hear it sometime if you want to tell it. She said she'd think about it. She drove to Fayetteville that evening. She sat at the kitchen table. Her daughter was working on a math problem that she couldn't figure out, and she brought it to Lassiter with the worksheet and a pencil and the expression of someone who has been staring at something for long enough that looking at it feels personal. Lassiter looked at the problem. She explained it in 3 steps. Her daughter looked at the steps. Then she looked up and said, "How do you know that?" Lassiter said, "I studied it." Her daughter said, "When?" She said, "A long time ago." Her daughter went back to the worksheet. Lassiter watched her work, the pencil moving across the page in careful loops, and she thought about the range and the general's face and the way Holt had held out the coffee cup like it wasn't anything, and she thought about the corridor in Deir ez-Zor in March 2 years ago and the 6 hours that she had spent holding something together in the dark that she had not fully put down since. She thought about what it meant to be seen. Her daughter looked up from the worksheet. She said, "Did I do it right?" Lassiter looked at the work. She said, "Yeah, you got it." Her daughter went back to the next problem. Lassiter wrapped her hands around her coffee cup and looked at the kitchen window where the dark was settling in over Fayetteville. And she let herself sit there for a while in the particular quiet of a room where nothing is required of you, and she did not think about Syria. Not tonight.